After a long wait, the HTML dialog element is finally supported by both Firefox and WebKit browsers. This means it now has universal coverage across all modern browsers and therefore is suddenly a lot more useful. This includes being potentially valuable in Hype projects as a quick way to build consistent-looking modals and pop-ups. In this video, I'll delve into how this element can help Hype developers implement these user interface elements in their projects. Specifically, I'll explain how using this element is a particularly efficient way to handle the issues of stacking order, sizing dynamics, background styling, and animation. Later I'll show how to use this element to gather user inputs or selections in a simple demo project. And lastly, I'll reveal how to read out the results of this selection into a custom variable and then display it in a separate indicator field. So, if that sounds interesting to you, let's get started by comparing the relative merits of this new approach. If you're used to interactively assembling your animation or app in Hype, you're probably wondering, why do I suddenly need to start using code for something I can do with Hype's visual tools? Well, the value proposition here is simple. With a small amount of strategically placed HTML code, you can save yourself a lot of time and unnecessary work. I've made this table to illustrate exactly what I mean. So, let's start out by comparing the work necessary to make a generic dialog. In Hype, you'll need to select an appropriate collection of text fields, shapes, and buttons, assemble them into a group, define the group's position, and then construct a timeline to animate it into view. For the same dialog created in HTML, you can just give it the necessary text, and it's positioned and animated automatically. And if you want to update this dialog, the browser handles that without any further adjustments. Just update the text and button names. This goes for scaling as well. HTML dialogs are dynamically scaled relative to the viewport at runtime. In comparison, scaling in Hype is both static and absolute. This means it must be defined at design time and the developer must anticipate all the ways it might be rendered on different devices. All of these things mean it is easier to achieve a consistent appearance without worrying about device size and orientation if you employ the HTML dialog element. In a similar vein, you always need to worry about stacking order in Hype. Namely, what element is on top and whether or not one UI element is going to obscure another. This isn't a problem with the HTML dialog element. It's always on top. Other things come for free with this element as well. For instance, if you want your dialog or pop-up to have focus, or to include a background that grays out the rest of the interface, then you'll need to manually construct this in Hype. Likewise, if you want a cancel button or escape functionality, then you'll need to implement that in code yourself. Of course, if you let the browser render these things, that's less you need to worry about. The same goes for accessibility concerns. Screen readers automatically announce dialogues constructed in semantic HTML. This is something that's difficult and tiresome to implement in Hype. There's also a potential performance advantage to letting the system handle these functions. Specifically, a HTML dialog element is rendered at the operating system speed, which nowadays can be significantly faster than Hype's animation speed, which is pegged at 30 frames per second. So, if that's the value proposition, how do we put this idea into practice? Well, I'll consider that next. Here's my example project. It has a classic Hype dialog on the left and one made with the HTML dialog element on the right. When I run this project in the browser, you can see how both dialogs allow the user to make a selection from a drop-down box and then take that result and display it in a common output indicator named your selection. But while both dialogs look and behave similarly, if you expand the canvas and show the parts of the design that are usually hidden, you can see how each dialog is constructed differently. On the left, you can see a group of shapes and buttons grouped with an HTML select element that together makes up the regular Hype dialog. In comparison, the element on the right is a single Hype container to which I've added some regular HTML. This container is actually just a simple rectangle without a border or a color fill. I've included a background image so that you can see this container, but this image serves no real purpose. Clearly, there's more going on inside these dialogs than their outward appearance suggests. So, let's dig a little deeper and compare what code is being used to construct them and power their respective behaviors. To start, let's focus on the classic Hype dialog because there's less code involved there. In this part of the user interface, everything is regular Hype elements except for one piece of code nested inside an empty container. Outwardly, this container looks like an everyday drop-down selector. But if you look at its inner HTML, you can see it's pure code. You can see that code here. And when viewed in the timeline inspector, that container resides alongside other elements in a group labeled classic dialog. All these elements are animated into view as a group using a regular hype timeline. If we expand the code in this container, you can see it's just a straightforward HTML selector that I've given a unique identifier so that I can follow it with JavaScript. Now, if we switch to the right side of the user interface and examine the dialog generated solely in HTML, things aren't enormously different. There is still the same selector element code. But now, it and some new items are enclosed within a pair of dialog tags. Here. And here. And while there are no hype buttons anymore, two HTML buttons which are enclosed within a pair of menu tags perform the same function. What's missing from this version are the hype shapes and labels that formed the initial dialog and the timelines that animated it. Those features are now handled automatically by the browser. So that's one less thing you need to worry about. So that's the code we needed to set up the user interface, but we're not finished yet. No matter which way you choose to set up this dialog, you'll still need some additional code to capture and process any selections a user might make. You'll also need a way to gracefully exit if the user presses the cancel button. The code to achieve this in each case is very similar. It involves creating references to the select control in each dialog button and then setting up event listeners on each of these elements. This code is relatively straightforward and in most cases can be copied and pasted directly into a new project. But in case you want to adapt it for your own purposes, I'll briefly explain what each part does. Let's start with the classic dialog. In the first section of this code, I've captured references to all the essential parts of this dialog so that I can use them later. You can see that highlighted here. At the end of this section, I've also created a variable called selectedOption where I plan to store and update any selections made by the user. To start, I've set that to null, indicating there is no existing selection each time this dialog is launched. However, this does allow a user to change their selection as often as they like while the dialog is active. In the next section of code, I've used these references to create event listeners to capture any user events. In particular, I want to know if the user has made or updated a selection, or whether they have submitted or canceled out of the dialog. In the first case, if a user makes or changes a selection, an event that updates the variable I created earlier is triggered. If the user then closes out the dialog with the submit button, the current value of the variable is used to create a message that is written to the your selection indicator on the UI. If instead, they don't make a selection or just cancel out of the dialog, nothing further happens. In fact, clicking on the cancel button simply reverses the timeline that shows the dialog in the first place, and it is hidden without changing the output indicator. Moving on to the second part of our demo and the code that accompanies our dialog created with the HTML dialog element, you can see that outwardly the code looks mostly similar to before. However, there is one exception to this. Because this element has only recently become available in Safari and Firefox browsers, there may still be users out there that haven't yet upgraded to a supported version of these browsers. So, before we show this dialog using the show modal method, it's important to check that it's supported. We do that here. This piece of code first confirms that the show modal method is an allowable function, something that's only true in browsers supporting the dialog element. If that turns out to be true, then we invoke that method to display the dialog. If this check fails, the user is presented with an alert message encouraging them to update their browser. The remainder of this code is effectively the same as before. We again start with a code block that captures references to all the essential parts of this dialog. You can see that here. At the end of this section, I've created another variable to capture the user's selection. This time, I've called it selectedOption. In the next section of code, I've used an event listener to detect when a user has made or updated a selection. This code is also the same as before. Lastly, the way submit and cancel events are handled differ slightly from the first example. Here we leverage the close event that accompanies the system dialog element. At this stage, we also check to see whether a selection has been made, and if so, we use the selection to construct an output to be displayed in the user interface. If the user cancels out of the dialog, the browser automatically closes and hides it. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to making dialogs and modals in Hype using the HTML dialog element. If you're interested to learn more about the neat things you can do with Hype, please check out my YouTube channel for other related videos. If you're interested to learn more about other things we're working on, Please check out our website at alteredmindware.com or contact me directly at alteredmindware@gmail.com.